Today we'll be tying the Montana Mini Intruder on a Waddington shank with a MP004 stinger hook off the back end. With these shanks, they're open at first, so you actually have to close them with the thread, much like you'd have to close the eye on a classic salmon hook. I'll be using some beadle-on wire to attach the stinger hook. I've doubled the wire through the eye, then I'll be tying it off the back end of the shank. I don't want it to be too far off. I'm only going to give it a little bit of a gap off the back of the hook shank. With these Waddington shanks, the oversized eye allows me to pass the wire through the eye and double it back. This will just give me a little bit of extra security with this wire. As you can see, I've got the hook tied in fairly close to the end of the shank. I really just don't want this fly to get overly long, especially since I'm using a shank that's slightly longer than you typically use on this fly. This is a 20 millimeter shank, and typically use a 15 millimeter shank for this particular pattern. So I'm using a slightly longer shank, a slightly bigger hook, but I'm tying the hook in quite close to the shank. So this next step is more of a prep step to make sure that the Flashabou that you're going to use for a lot of this fly is propped up nicely. With intruders, you'll either see this done with dubbing or you'll see it done with Estaz. Since I'm using dubbing here, I'm using a fairly generous clump of it so that I can get a nice flare. Tie it in on top, then double it over and tie it in on the bottom as well. Typically this pattern, you'd trim the butt sections there to shorten this up. However, I'm going to leave it a little bit longer here just to give the pattern a little bit more flow. Now I'm going to tie in Flashabou that'll become the tail of the fly. I'm going to double it around my thread and then pull it down onto the top of the hook shank. Here, I'll use my thumb to spread the crystal flash around the hook shank and then bind it down. Now I'll trim this Flashabou so it extends slightly further than the hook. It's going to end up being about an inch long. Here, I'm going to use some diamond braid to create the body. Tie your diamond braid in front of that rear bump. Then simply work it back to the point that you've locked in the rest. It's very easy for this style of fly to end up far too overdressed, so just be careful with each of the steps that you're working to keep it as slim as possible. Now, I'm going to tie the eyes in just behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to tightly wrap forward my diamond braid and then tie it down. Now, there's a variety of ways to do this next step that's again going to create a ramp for your flash. It really depends on not only your comfort level, but also the type of thread you're using. You can split your thread to create a bit of a loop for your dubbing. You can also just tie your dubbing in by touch dubbing it and wrapping it here. However, for me, I find it easiest since I'm using a thinner thread to just create a dubbing loop as I would normally. And then I'm going to run a bit more of that ice dub through this dubbing loop. I'm using a simple shepherd's hook here to close and spin my dubbing loop. The use of a dubbing loop, whether it's by splitting your thread or otherwise, is just going to make this fly more durable and keep it fishier for longer. Wrap in your dubbing loop, tie it down, and then brush it out. Now for this next step, you're going to tie in 2 sets of Flashabou, first to create the throat using red, and then to create the wing using copper. Take your thread back in front, double some of that red crystal flash over your thread, and lock it in at the throat. Then, once you've thrown in some locking wraps, bring your thread back behind the eyes and lock it down right under the neck of the fly. Trim that off so it's just short of the tail length. Repeat the same process for the wing using a bit more crystal flash so there's a bit more bulk. Trim the wing so it runs about the same length as your tail. For this final step, I'm going to tie in a clump of ice dub on the lower side of the head and a clump of Senyo's laser dub on the upper side of the head, and then lash them back to create a little bit of a head to the fly. The sculpin olive color of Senyo's laser dub is perfect to finish off this fly. Double back your dubbings, create a bit of a thread dam in front of them, and then whip finish. And there, after a bit of mess, you've got the Montana Mini Intruder. This is a great swing fly with a lot of flash and a lot of movement that's going to drop quickly through the column without a whole heck of a lot of bulk.